This is the S2G podcast. I'm Tanya Bekritzis. In this episode, we explore the origins of functional medicine and the future of the healthcare industry with renowned biochemist, educator, and entrepreneur, Dr. Jeff Bland. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, nor should it be used to evaluate any investment or security. It is not directed at or intended for any current or prospective investor in any investment vehicle sponsored by S2G. Investing involves risk, including the potential loss of capital. References to specific companies are for illustrative and educational purposes only and do not represent an endorsement or investment recommendation. S2G currently maintains an investment in Big Bold Health, and S2G's investment is not open to additional investors. The views expressed by podcast guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of S2G. For additional important information, please visit s2ginvestments.com/disclosures.
It's virtually impossible to birth a healthcare system within a disease care system. And that's no criticism of a disease care system. It's just a different language. It's a different approach.
What if the key to fixing our health isn't more treatment, but better function? In this episode of the S2G podcast, Dan Ripma, Vice President of the Food and Agriculture team at S2G, sits down with Dr. Jeff Bland, who is often referred to as the father of functional medicine. When it comes to modern healthcare, Jeff has been in the room for some of the most pivotal shifts over the last 50 years, giving him a uniquely comprehensive perspective on how the field has evolved. From pioneering vitamin E research and the founding of Natural Products Expo West, to launching the Institute for Functional Medicine and now leading Big Bold Health, Jeff has spent his career at the cutting edge of reimagining healthcare, illuminating the links between lifestyle and health outcomes, and empowering people to take back control of their own well-being. Jeff offers a rare vantage point into the rise of functional medicine, as well as what's coming next, from immune rejuvenation and an emphasis on the microbiome to precision diagnostics and targeted nutrition. He shares his insights into the factors that shaped our current healthcare system and why now is the time for bold moves in food as medicine, data-driven care, and an integrated approach that goes beyond just treating disease. If you're an entrepreneur, investor, or simply curious about the future of health and nutrition, this conversation will challenge you to think bigger about how we scale impact, drive innovation, and build a more holistic, personalized, and resilient healthcare system.
Jeff, thank you for spending time with us this morning. Excited to sit down with you outside of our usual work, focused on Big Bold Health. And I really wanted to have you kick off for people and talk about your career. It is both incredibly broad and incredibly deep. And I'd love for you to just talk about where you started and those points along the journey so that people have the context for the scope of your career.
Thanks, Dan. It's really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. And my relationship with you and S2G has really been both professionally but personally rewarding. So this is a joy to have this chance to share some thoughts. So for me, I was up in Southern California and was planning on going to medical school, and I was always a science geek. I guess I would call myself an athlete. I was a basketball player, and I'd played basketball all the way through college, D1 basketball.
I got to do a quick interruption there. You played with a famous player, didn't you?
I played for almost 2 years with UCLA and with John Wooden. He really was very instructive in my life because he, in my sophomore year, said, "Hey, Jeff, you're a reasonably good basketball player, but you're never going to make your living doing this. And I understand you're quite good in science, and science is hard because your labs are in the afternoon and it kind of interferes with basketball. But I think I could get you a transfer of your scholarship over to one of the new University of California campuses, Irvine, smaller school. You could probably play basketball there. It wouldn't interfere and do your science." And so that's what happened. I moved over to UCI where I played my last years, and it was a perfect fit. So that was a pretty instrumental moment. And I got married and went to University of Oregon Health Sciences in Portland and the chemistry department in Eugene. And that led me into clinical biochemistry, where I really found a home. I liked that kind of geekism of application of human biology to understanding how people got sick. That was always my interest, was asking the question, what are the mechanisms by which people get ill other than infectious disease? And back then, this is the 60s, we really didn't have a lot of the knowledge that we have today in terms of cell biology and how the chronic diseases emerge out of cellular dysfunction. And so I feel privileged that I was early on getting in that field, because the explosion of information starting in the 70s until today has really birthed a whole different view of the origin of chronic illness and how lifestyle, diet, and environment play roles in that mechanistically and ultimately give rise to function that is either health or disease. And so that led ultimately to an academic appointment at the University of Puget Sound, where I was a dual appointment in chemistry and environmental science, starting this environmental science program. And it allowed me to couple that together with my biochemistry interest, human biochemistry. And my first graduate student was a gentleman that wanted to work on vitamin E. This is 1971. Bruce Chasen. I remember he went on ultimately to go to Johns Hopkins, become a professor of medicine there many years later. But Bruce said, I really want to study vitamin E and how it works. I didn't know anything about vitamin E at all. And I wasn't really what I would call a nutrition-focused person at that point. But I said, okay, you've got a zeal for it. Let's give it a whirl. It turned out we were lucky. We chose a good project. We got some very good results about the mechanism of action of how vitamin E helps to protect against cellular injury and aging. We published a number of papers. Those got us into the media. And for the first time, I was asked to speak to medical groups about the role that vitamin E plays in human physiology. And I did lecture tours in Europe and so forth and so on. And that ultimately introduced me then to the natural foods industry. And there were these really forward-looking young men and women who had started in the 70s natural food stores that were the next level beyond that of a health food store. We're more focused on organic agriculture and the whole nature of the planet. So I affiliated with them as an advisor in those stores, Bread and Circus, Mrs. Gooch's, Alfalfa's, Whole Foods, Nature's Food and Tool, Fresh Fields. The owners of those stores ultimately rolled up into Whole Foods and became the Whole Foods chain of stores. And I was involved in that whole process and the start of what has now become, I think, the largest trade show in California, which is the Natural Foods Expo. A gentleman by the name of Doug Green, probably the best entrepreneur I've ever met in my life, an amazing guy. And he went to Malibu. Across the Pacific Coast Highway was a small little health food store, and he got intrigued with the industry, and he asked the proprietor, the owner, it was an older woman, what her plans were. And she said, I'm going to sell the store. I think I need to retire. He said, how about if I bought the store from you? So then he went to the only trade show that the natural foods industry had at that time. It was the Natural Nutritional Foods Association meeting in Las Vegas every year in July. And it was pretty folksy. And so he went to the president of the organization. He said, I'm now in your industry. I own a store. I really like what's going on, but I think I could help you to dress up this industry quite a bit and make it more investment worthy. And they said, we don't really need any help. Everything's going fine. So then he went back and got thinking about that. And being the entrepreneur that he is, he said, okay, then I'm going to form my own trade show. And he went to the Anaheim Convention Center, forced his way in by waiting in the waiting room for the manager. He said, I want to do a trade show here. And he said, what organization do you represent? None. What kind of financial backing you have? He says, I have my credit card. He kept coming back, and eventually the guy gave in and said, okay, we're going to give you one shot with some space at the Anaheim Convention Center, and if you don't make good, this will be it. And of course, that started what has become the largest trade show. And so Doug then did do exactly what he said he was going to do. He helped make that industry more investment worthy. And then these young people that had vision started to have a place they could rally together and start to gain momentum. And that became the Organic Action Group and Organic Standards and all sorts of things that were birthed out of that by mobilizing that group. And so I was still a professor at the time. And then I took a sabbatical. In 1982, I was invited by two-time Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling down at Stanford to come down and run a research lab in his Institute of Science and Medicine in Palo Alto, which was a life changer for me because after my 2 years there, he then asked me a question. He said, so Jeff, you've done really great work here. I know you're going back to your tenured faculty position, but I'm just wondering, do you think your classroom is big enough? Now, I then got in the car with my family to drive home the 1,100 miles back to Puget Sound. And it was on my mind the whole time. What was this message of this person that he and his wife, Ava Helen, who I admired and saw them as much more than just scientists. They were people of the universe, basically. And by the time I got home, I recognized that, no, I was going to give up my tenured faculty position. I was going to start a organization to teach physicians how to do nutritional medicine in their practice. That ultimately led us to develop a company, Metagenics, that served physicians. We became the largest product and information company for health practitioners in nutrition. We ultimately ended up in 37 countries and had 4 manufacturing plants and 2,000 employees, which we sold in 2010. And during that period of time, my wife then came to me and said, Jeff, you're meeting all these amazing people. You've traveled all these millions of miles around the world. Maybe we ought to host a meeting with these thought leaders just to sit down and do a whiteboard discussion about what could the healthcare system be if we were to optimize it. If we took out licensure and reimbursement, we just talked about the architecture, what would it be? And so she then put together a meeting in Victoria, British Columbia on Vancouver Island. I invited about 45 of these people from different disciplines that I thought very highly of, and they, believe it or not, all came. And we spent 3 days just doing a whiteboard discussion. It was really probably one of the most intellectually stimulating discussions I'd ever been involved with. And at the end, everyone said, hey, let's do this again next year. We're chopping some wood and carrying some water. So we got back again, same place the following year. This was June of 1989. That I had this dream that what we had been talking about is a form of healthcare that was not focused on a disease, it was focused on function. And so maybe we ought to call this functional medicine. And I came back and talked to the group about that, and they said, well, it's an interesting idea, Jeff, but function is a pejorative term in medicine. It's either geriatric, rehabilitative medicine, or it's psychosomatic medicine. It doesn't really have a very forward-looking connotation. I said, that's true historically, but I follow the literature very carefully. And now we're seeing functional cardiology, functional radiology, functional endocrinology. So maybe it's going to be a different context of that word. Maybe we should try to skate to where the puck is going, to use that old metaphor. Maybe because we sponsored the meeting, everyone said, okay, let's try it. And so my wife founded the Institute for Functional Medicine in 1990, which now, 35 years later, if I look back at the things that have made the most substantive contribution, it's probably the starting of the Institute for Functional Medicine in my life. That then led me ultimately to move on into biotechnology. I was a founder and CEO of a biopharma company, Kindex Therapeutics, later to be Kindex Pharmaceuticals, that developed a new-to-nature molecule that came out of some natural product work that we had done for the treatment of polycystic ovary syndrome in women. We made some very substantial contributions to the understanding of the etiology of PCOS. And then that led me into starting the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute, where we could bring together academics with thought leaders and really asking how could we use lifestyle to personalize therapy by the new technologies that were starting to come about using machine learning, informatics, using wearable devices, using new biometrics, and start to really piece together how we're going to personalize this whole concept of healthcare. So that's the kind of run of the show for me the last years.
I'm curious, 1982, you're getting back to Fusion Sound. You've decided to start this business. Like at that point, like what was the vision for you of what you were going and doing?
I had learned so much from my experience at the Pauling Institute in that period, really got me to recognize that there was a tremendous body of knowledge sitting here that was waiting to be applied, but it was not going to come out of medical school education for a number of years. And that the body of literature that was really substantial, that could provide solutions to chronic illness that were not being addressed very successfully with the traditional pathology-focused medicine. We had good medicine, so I don't want to criticize, but it was focused pretty much on, I would call it hospital-based type of therapeutics versus the chronic illness, things that were emerging like type 2 diabetes and things that were related to cognitive function, things that were related to clinical autoimmune disorders, digestive disorders, psychobiological disorders related to depression, mood swings, and things of this nature. We really didn't have good solutions for those that were, I think, related to not applying the right model. That it wasn't a disease model we needed, it was a health model that we needed. And we needed to look at what the literature was teaching us about health at the cellular level. And I fortunately knew enough really bright people that were looking for a place to have a platform that they could talk about these ideas and stitch them together into kind of a comprehensive approach. And so I thought maybe I can be the person who assembles those individuals, who puts together the kind of educational models. And I'm a teacher at heart. That's where I started. So maybe I can apply that to birthing this field.
It's incredible. The healthcare industry has changed a lot over that period of time.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see more integration of nutrition, lifestyle into the healthcare system. But you've been a big part of that evolution. Where do you think we are now? What does it look like today?
Yeah, I think that's really a fantastic question, Dan, because much of what I was hopeful that I would see happen, which at times seemed like an apparition, maybe has really started to happen. And I feel very fortunate I'm still around here to witness it. And I think it's the convergence of so many different things. And I could start with one that seems maybe very obvious, but has been a major force of change, and that's the transportable electronic medical record. If you think back, it wasn't too many years ago that a person could never get any of their own data. It was all mysteriously captured by their doctor, then concealed because the presumption was, oh, we'd only confuse the patient if they had access to their information. We've seen the democratization of health information, and that's a huge paradigm shift. In fact, I consider it like an irreversible change. Once you go over that threshold, you might say now people have access to information that might be really scary. And I think if you can teach people that information and understanding is better than naivete in giving people the opportunity to make intelligent decisions about their lives, and also helping them to know where their competency stops and where they need a professional to help them to make the appropriate decisions, that change has really occurred within the last 10 years. And then you put on top of that, now we're starting to see the ability to evaluate function, health, using different biometrics. When I started in this field, now decades ago, and you would go to your doctor during that period of time to get a regular physical, and they took blood and you had your blood analyzed. We're basically what's called a complete blood count. So you'd look at the type of blood cells and how your hemoglobin was and how your white blood cells were. And then there would be a series of other blood tests that were analytes, liver enzymes, and blood sugar and blood fat. But there was one thing that was in that blood panel which didn't fit with the other things, and that's blood cholesterol. Because elevated blood cholesterol is not a diagnosis for any disease. It is a functional determinant of something going on that's much more complex. And so we did a statistical relationship between elevated blood cholesterol and heart disease, but we cannot say that cholesterol causes heart disease. It's an associated factor. But then with cholesterol being in there as a wild card, then people said, where does cholesterol come from? And the first simple mind was what's in our diet. So we started to say, okay, gee whiz, we better limit cholesterol in our diet. And then, of course, we've proven that's not the case at all over years. And we've even proven that elevated cholesterol or lower cholesterol are indications of metabolic disturbances, not just related solely to something wrong with your heart. And so that kind of changed the pattern of thinking, because when a doctor was asked the question by the patient, my cholesterol is elevated, what does that mean? And the doctor would say, well, it's not a disease, but we're going to give you a preventive medicine called a statin, because it may be that you'll get a disease, and this statin will lower your cholesterol, and we think it will then lower your risk to heart disease. That's a whole different mentality, philosophy. That kind of opened the door, particularly when the fingerstick cholesterol test became available, because this could be done at shopping malls. And so that it was the opening of the door to medical prevention. And then how that related to lifestyle, how that related to diet. So from that, new biomarkers started to appear. And so people started then asking the question, is blood sugar alone a sine qua non for evaluating how your body manages the metabolism of sugar? And people said, no, actually, you might have your blood sugar at okay levels, but you could still have some problems because your sugar might be going through different highs and lows throughout the day. And now you have to look at the effect over time. That becomes the A1C test. And now we start to say, oh, gee, you might not have elevated fasting blood sugar, but you might actually have a problem with the way your body manages sugar, which we call prediabetes. And that became metabolic syndrome. then that ties to dyslipidemia, to the effects that fats in your blood are interrelated to triglycerides, which then led to the development of fractionating the fats into lipoproteins. So you have your VLDLs and your HDLs, which led into the subfractionation into particle numbers and particle size. All of these become more specific in the understanding of the functional disturbances at the metabolic level of that individual that puts them into a category of increased risk, all of which can be modified by intervention, not necessarily with drugs, but lifestyle. So all this becomes part of the evolution over decades to where we now start having a series of tools in the toolkit that a health practitioner can use for assessing aspects of function. Then we tie that together with what has become the kind of topic du jour right now, which is the gut microbiome. That came from the fact that we started to see extraordinary prevalence of digestive disorders, particularly peptic ulcer disease and reflux disorders in the population. And it was said to be caused by stress, and the treatment was drink milk or take antacids. And then later, this family doc in Australia said, I don't think that's what's causing this. I think this is an infection caused by bugs in the gut that are infecting the mucosal surfaces of our intestinal tract. Helicobacter pylori is what he discovered. And being a family doc, ultimately went on to win a Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology for this discovery. And in fact, the way he proved it was he cultured H. pylori, and then he personally exposed himself by drinking it and produced peptic ulcer disease. That's the proof of the pudding when you go to that level. And over time then, people started to say, well, gee whiz, what's the microbiological community like down there? Maybe there's a lot of other stuff in the large intestine. And then people started to go back to Eli Metchnikoff's work at the Pasteur Institute. He was also a Nobel Prize winner for the discovery of the innate immune system. He wrote a book called Prolongation of Life, in which the treatment of individuals who had chronic illness was to give them enemas of Lactobacillus bulgaricus, enemas of yogurt. Because his thought was that the disturbance of the microbiological community in our intestinal tract was a contributor to systemic disease. And we started actually lecturing to docs about what we call gut dysbiosis, leaky gut. And at first it was a big pushback. Gastroenterologists called us crazy. They said there was no such thing. Now it's well accepted. So it took another 20 years for this to rise up and gain more prominence. And the reason for it was because we finally had some of the tools necessary to analyze this, to measure the immune system of the gut, showing that it can be inflamed when you have this funny kinds of bugs going on in your gut. And so I think all these tools and the development of the understanding of cellular biology and activation of the consuming public who was finding some dissatisfaction with the way their healthcare was being delivered because they weren't getting better. They were just symptom suppressing a lot of things that were not being treated in ways that could lead to the remediation. I think all those factors started to really come together to create a paradigm shift in which people moved away from just sole thought about diagnosis to starting to think about wellness or health from a perspective of what can I do if I'm walking around with fatigue, low energy, muscle pain, depression, sleep disturbances. I don't want to take 15 different drugs, each for those symptoms. I want to understand what the origin is, and that's what we call root cause. And that was the origin then of the functional medicine model.
It's incredible to hear about the history and your thoughts on where we are today. And we talked about your career up to a point, but the point that we haven't talked about is where you and I have gotten to know each other, which is founding Big Bold Health. And so can you just talk a little bit about, you saw this evolution of the healthcare system, why Big Bold Health? Why is that what you decided to start next and work to address some of these issues?
So it's actually 50 years. And so when I go back and did a retrospective of what I've learned over those 50 years, what I've come to recognize is that the majority of the problems that we experience in terms of healthcare have their origin in the interrelationship between our immune system and our nervous system. And then I asked myself the question, why would that be? And my simple answer, which may not be true, but it's my operative answer, is that these are the two systems of the body that are in communication with the outside world 24/7, 365. And so they're bringing information back from the outside world, and then they're telling the body how to respond. And so a lot of the things that we experience as it pertains to our function is our body's nervous and immune system cross-talking to try to defend us or respond to the environment that we find ourselves. And then I said, of those two, the system that can change most rapidly in terms of the number of types of cells is the immune system, because every 90 days, approximately, the immune cells in our body are replaced by new immune cells. What I came to understand from research that's been done over the last couple of decades in immunology is that as we grow older, the general thought is that our immune system cells are worse off than the ones that they are replacing. That's called immunosenescence, aging of the immune system. And then I started to look at what are the determinants of aging that would actually predict how long a person would live based on their function. And it turns out that there's a really strong correlation between not your chronological age of your immune system, but its biological functional age. And I said, hold it. If you can change your immune system every 90 days, and this is a major determinant of how long you're going to live and how healthy you're going to live, maybe we need to really be focusing more on immune health. And then I started to ask, what do people really know about immune health? And most people, even most physicians, think of the immune system as the defense against virus and bacteria. And it is, by the way. So I don't want to minimize that importance. But the immune system does so much more than that in its seek-and interrogation system. It regenerates tissues. It speaks to every organ in your body. And so the immune system is there doing a job to define who you will be, how you look, act, and feel in the response to how it sees your outside and inside world. And what I came to recognize is not being focused on at all. We have what we call immune boosting. What does immune boosting mean? I say, we take vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc or elderberry to boost your immune system. Because sometimes you don't want to boost it because boost it means you just get more inflammation. We want to make it so that it's resilient to the moment so that it will bring your function back to a resting state of health. And you do that by what we call immunorejuvenation. That was a term that I applied. I said, maybe we should focus on trying to understand how to actually rejuvenate the immune system to put it into a functional state of lower biological age. And maybe we should look historically at cultures that have done that without a high technology where the blue zones reside, because these people have very interesting immune resilience. And so when you start doing that and ask, how do they live? You start recognizing certain lifestyle habits, and there's also certain dietary patterns that are common among those blue zone areas. Even Loma Linda, California, in the middle of LA County, is a blue zone because those people are Seventh-day Adventists and they eat foods that are high in the nutrients that you find in Sardinia or in these other regions around the planet that are called blue zones. And so I started to say, okay, then what are those foods? And how do we bring them back into our diet? And what are the principles that are actually influencing the immune system? And that became Big Bold Health, that urgency to try to answer that question.
Yeah. You've always been pretty far ahead of the game, seeing in the future. And so when you look 10, 20 years out from now, what do you see? Like, what do you think people should be thinking about today to build the healthcare system of the future in 10 or 20 years?
I think it's happening right now, Dan, in a very interesting way. I've said something over the years that it's virtually impossible to birth a healthcare system within a disease care system. And that's no criticism of a disease care system. It's just a different language. It's a different approach. You're more worried about histopathology and cytology and looking at cells that are seriously injured. And so in a sequence of function, it's at the later sequence of where the cells are injured. And fortunately, we have really a good disease care system. And the incentives for young women and men to go into healthcare has always been in disease care, because that's where the money was. That's where you had diagnostic groups. That's where insurance reimbursement could be tied to different diagnoses. And I hope I'm not sounding critical of medicine because I'm a product of that environment myself. But nothing that I just said there has anything to do with health, because the concept in the disease-focused system is that health is the absence of disease. And I think any human being understands that their health is actually more than the absence of disease. And so when I ask that question, where does healthcare, where should it reside? And then we say, well, it resides in the public health system. But the public health system is based upon mass statistics. It's a group aggregate. What we learn now more and more with the genomic revolution that we find ourselves is that there's much more difference between people than we understood before we started deciphering the genome. And now we have epigenetics laid on top of that tells us that our environment that we live in, the food we eat, actually puts marks on our genes. It tells our genes how they're going to be expressed. And so that can then modify how we actually look, act, and feel. So this construct that we maybe need something different than the public health system to personalize the care seemed unrealistic because there was no way to scale it. Maybe it would be reserved just for the elite that could afford to have their own private people to do this work for them. But now with machine learning and AI and all this new tools of automation of technology, so that you can actually, from a blood spot now, and this is a technology we're working on with a variety of people, you can analyze over 1,200 different biomarkers from one spot of blood on a piece of filter paper. And you can do that for less than $100. So the concept that we can't scale this, I don't think is true anymore. So now we can start thinking about what a healthcare system might look like. And then it addresses the question of, how about medical education? What about reimbursement? What about certification of professionals? Could I see that over time we would actually end up with those individuals who love pathology and disease, and they do that, and they become the surgeons and do their things. And then there are these other individuals who really want to focus on what we might have called internal medicine before, but this is like personalized health medicine. And I think that is starting to emerge as a trend. And then you say, well, can it ever be reimbursed? And I think if the data can be assembled, which it is starting to be assembled to show the cost benefit of the pound of prevention worth a ton of cure, which I think will show cost effectiveness, then we start to have the driver for reprioritizing how dollars flow through the system.
How do you think people should consider the current political environment, policy changes, advances in some private companies? How should people think about this point in time that, as we've talked about, does feel a little bit special in many ways? There's been a little bit of a catch up in terms of these things becoming more mainstream and part of the kind of national discourse. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that right now, because of the availability for information, and that information can be founded on different ways of assessing truth. But one thing that we can say for sure is that the body of understanding of how we as human beings respond to our environments at the physiological, emotional, functional level is rapidly advancing. The accrual of new information is exponential. And you have to filter the wheat from the chaff, but the momentum for change is on the J curve. And then it opens us up to ask questions about, did we, because we were so focused on pathology, just gloss over the things that we should have been learning about health and function over that period of time? And I think that's what is starting to be recognized. And I see it happening at major medical research institutions. You're starting to see a lot of these things that were considered to be really heretical now start to become feature sets of contemporary research and things that are really changing opinions. And it's happening rapidly. I believe businesses will then grow up, and I believe that it will test the mastodons of the industry as to whether they can survive. New companies are coming now with valuations that are extraordinary. Function Health being an example. Its recent enterprise value, according to what I saw in most recent publications, was $2.5 billion. It's a year and a half old, And it is the fastest growing health company I've ever seen in my life. And it is built on a new technology because people are going in to get 12 tubes of blood taken to get 120 analytes measured and then some interpretation of their physiology. So all these are indications to me of entrepreneurial dynamism. And now we can go down into agriculture and food development and food systems, and huge number of new companies are going to come out that are appropriating and leveraging the power of nature without futzing around and putting new chemicals into it. So I think these are signs of change.
Oh, it's incredible. And you touched on something that I wanted to ask you, which is there a heretical idea today that you believe is more right than wrong, even if the data isn't there?
Oh boy, I think there's a number of ways that I could answer that. That's a really good question. The one that popped into my mind first, which may not be the best answer, but it's the one that first occupied my brain, is cancer. And what we're learning about cancer as a metabolic disorder and the microenvironment that supports cancer and how it relates to the immune system's architecture and the role that how and where we live plays in how that manifests itself and how it is ultimately treated. It's really fascinating for me, as an example, to watch, I think, the change in Siddhartha Mukherjee's philosophy, who is a brilliant guy. And Emperor of All Maladies book was one of the best written books that I've ever read in the medical science area. I think his views originally, this is my interpretation, was that diet played a very small role in cancer or in its treatment. I think that's changed dramatically over the years. And I'm very privileged that we had him as a speaker at our meetings some 6-7 years ago and exposed him to some of the things that we were doing in this functional medicine environment. I'm not saying that was a decider, but I think that and his relationship with Cantrell and how he now sees the insulin story playing a role in cancer as a metabolic component and how diet may influence it. These are all signs of change. He is a leading thinker. And I think I could use the same argument for autoimmune diseases. We're seeing a rapid increase, particularly in women. 80% of people who get autoimmune disease are female, and there's some reason for that I could go into, I think, related to the endocrine and immune system of women. But we're starting to see now this similarly approaches towards the remediation and I would call it prevention of autoimmune disorders that is related again to similar themes as to how diet influences cancer and how it responds to diet and lifestyle and the microbiome, which responds to diet. So all these are starting to become a web of interactive understanding that I believe is going to birth some really interesting systems biology companies that are harnessing these concepts and making them consumer friendly and accessible, and changes everything literally from the ground up all the way through the system.
Yeah. We live in a world now where hope might be a little anemic. What makes you hopeful about this point in time in this industry?
Quite honestly, one of the things that gave me the greatest hope of all was, and this might sound self-serving, but it's actually my truthful belief, was S2G. To think that a investment company could be formed with the vision that you can take the risk of investing in people who have this thought as to how they're going to translate into operative behavior that makes a viable company out of it, that can produce a profit. I think back in my life to when I was involved with the Organic Standards Act and the advocacy of a bunch of post-hippie guys and women who then ultimately mobilized to go to the government and develop the organic standards certification and approval, which we thought was impossible. We just kept hacking at it until it ultimately happened. I think that now the compression of time allows these things to happen even more quickly. And I think the hope is that there is a critical mass of individuals who have advocacy and are willing to put their money, time, and effort behind their voice to create a different environment. It doesn't take a lot of statistical understanding to see that we've got real problem with our kids. if they are the litmus test for a culture, then we better really wake up and do something quickly. To think that there is this prevalence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disorders in teenagers. I mean, when I was in medical school, NASH was considered unusual in adults. It reminds me a lot about coronary heart disease at the turn of the last century was considered very unusual. In fact, it was so unusual that if there was in the clinic a person that had heart disease, that everyone would have to run down and study them because they might not see another one. That was 150 years ago. So we learn from our experience where we need to put our emphasis. And I think that's where it is right now. And I think the controversy that surrounds this is a reasonable controversy to have. It's reasonable to have discomfort. It's reasonable to have some energy in the system, because staying on the status quo is not going to take us to where we need to go. So that, to me, that's the hope.
I think that's a great place to wrap. And thank you for the kind words. It's been lovely having a conversation with you and walking through your 50 plus years in this industry and learning where you think we're going.
Thank you. It's a privilege to have the chance to even describe those 50 years, because each of us has our own history, all of which couples together to create what we call our society. And we all have great stories. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about mine.
Thank you for tuning into the S2G podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with a friend. For more information or to connect with us, check out s2ginvestments.com.